On the morning before Thanksgiving, the town of Silverpine woke up believing everything was fine. The church doors were open, the tables were set, the prayers were ready. What no one wanted to admit was this: the very building they planned to give thanks in might collapse under their feet. And one broken man, one sick mother, and two little boys were about to decide whether the truth would stay buried or finally be spoken aloud. What happens next will make you believe in quiet miracles and second chances for the forgotten. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. If you believe no child or animal should ever face fear alone, hit subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs hope. Silverpine, Montana, looked like it had been carved out of winter rather than built by men. The town sat in a shallow bowl between pine-dark ridges, its few streets packed hard with ice and old snow that never fully melted this time of year. Wind came off the slopes in steady, needling sheets, driving flakes sideways until they found the seams of coats and the gaps between scarf and collar. Chimney smoke didn't rise so much as it flattened and ran, pressed low by the weather. Even the sound of the place, the creak of a signboard, the ring of a doorbell, a wagon wheel groaning through slush, felt dampened and hurried, as if everything in Silverpine was trying to finish before the cold noticed it. Thanksgiving was 3 days away. The town made a modest effort to show it. A hand-painted board outside the church read, "Thanksgiving Service, Community Meal," the word community underlined twice. In the general store window, someone had taped up a paper turkey that curled at the edges from condensation. A butcher's chalkboard listed turkey, limited like a warning rather than an invitation. Small gestures, practical and restrained, the way a poor town tried to remember it had once been cheerful. Caleb Rowan walked through that thin attempt at warmth without slowing. He moved at a steady pace, head down, shoulders set against the wind. He was in his early 40s, tall and rangy, built more from endurance than strength now. His coat, dark wool, mended at the elbow, hung looser than it should have, and his boots were the kind that had been resoled enough times to outlive their original shape. A trimmed beard covered his jaw, the hair along his chin and temples threaded with premature gray. A narrow scar cut through his right eyebrow, pale against weathered skin. His eyes were the color of river stones in winter, steady and tired, giving away little. If he'd ever been handsome, it had been the blunt kind. Sharp cheekbones, a strong nose, a face that looked made for hard decisions. Grief had not softened him. It had made him economical. He carried a small satchel across his shoulder. It didn't bulge with supplies, only the bare necessities of a man who planned to keep moving. A tin cup, a rolled blanket, a few cartridges, a folding knife. Under his coat, a revolver rode against his ribs, concealed by habit rather than threat. Caleb didn't flash weapons. A man who had worn a badge long enough learned that a gun shown too early did more harm than good. People noticed him anyway, not in an obvious way. Silverpine wasn't a town that stared openly, but in the small shifts that mattered. A woman in a shawl drew her child closer on the boardwalk. A man lingered a fraction longer at a doorway, as if deciding whether to go in or step out. A curtain moved and fell back into place. Caleb's presence didn't belong to their patterns, and in a town tightened by winter, anything unfamiliar was treated like a nail on the floor. Something you might not see at first, but you'd remember once you stepped on it. He passed the church first. It stood higher than the other buildings, painted white, its steeple clean-lined against a slate ski. The structure looked new enough to still smell of fresh lumber and tar, built with money that didn't match the rest of the town. Crates of canned goods and sacks of potatoes sat under an awning, ready for the advertised community meal. Two women moved briskly between the crates and the door. One, middle-aged, broad-shouldered, cheeks red from the wind, kept her gaze down. Her movements were efficient, practiced, and her mouth was set in a line that suggested she'd learned to swallow opinions before they escaped. She glanced at Caleb once, quick and assessing, then looked away as if looking too long might invite trouble. Caleb didn't stop. He had learned to take information without accepting responsibility for it. It was the only way he'd managed to survive the last few years. 4 years earlier, he had not been a man passing through towns like smoke. He had been a U.S. Marshal. The badge had sat on his chest with a kind of purpose, and people had stepped aside when he entered a room. He'd been careful with strangers, firm with criminals, and quietly patient with children, though he pretended otherwise. His wife had been the one who teased that patience out into the open. Her name had been Sarah. She was tall and slim, with auburn hair that she pinned up when she worked and let down when she wanted to feel unguarded. Her skin freckled easily in summer, and in winter it went pale and translucent around her cheekbones. She had a habit of pressing her hand to Caleb's shoulder when she walked past him, a brief touch that always felt like a promise. Sarah's laughter had been quick, not loud, but steady, something that made a room feel less sharp. She could talk to anyone without making them feel handled. She made small homes feel large. Their son, Thomas, had been 6 when he died. He had Caleb's gray eyes and Sarah's mouth, black hair that refused to stay combed, and a way of asking questions that made adults look over their shoulders as if the truth might be hiding nearby. On Thanksgivings, Thomas had taken the ritual seriously. Sarah would set the table with whatever they had, cornbread, beans, a chicken if luck allowed, and Thomas would announce what he was thankful for like he was reading a proclamation. Caleb had pretended to be annoyed, and Sarah would have looked at him over the rim of a cup with that expression that said, "You love this. Stop acting like you don't." Then there had been the fire. Caleb rarely spoke of it, and even in his own mind he avoided the details because they came in fragments that cut too cleanly. The smell of smoke soaked into wool, a window bright as a furnace mouth, the sound of wood failing, his own voice shouting names that didn't answer. The memory ended the same way every time, with him. Standing in ash and quiet, the badge suddenly ridiculous on his chest, the law feeling like a story told to children to help them sleep. After that, he'd taken off the badge and never put it back on. He didn't leave a note or make a speech. He just walked. At first it had been for a week, then a month, then long enough that no place felt like it had claim on him. Towns blurred into one another, the same stoops, the same stairs, the same clocks that kept ticking no matter what a man lost. Caleb learned to avoid holidays because they were designed to trap you in reflection. Thanksgiving was the worst of them, too quiet, too domestic, too full of chairs that remembered who used to sit in them. Now, Silverpine had been meant to be one more place he crossed off without consequence. He only needed to get out of the wind long enough to let the worst of the storm pass. Coffee if he could afford it, a corner if someone would allow it, then the road again. He had become good at that plan. He passed the general store. Through the fogged glass he saw shelves stacked neatly and a potbelly stove glowing at the back. The bell above the door twitched in the wind but didn't ring. A man stood under the store awning, smoking without pleasure. He was tall, with a thick neck, face ruddy from cold and liquor, and he watched the street with the bored alertness of someone hired to notice details. His hands stayed near his belt, no badge, no uniform, just the posture of a man who'd learned his authority came from someone else's money. Caleb marked him and kept moving. Down the block, the bank sat like a brick commandment. The sign above it read, "Black Hollow Company," in dark letters that looked freshly painted. Men came and went from the door with a sense of belonging the rest of the town didn't seem to have. The building's windows were clear, not frosted over like the others, and that small difference told Caleb more than any conversation could. Power insulated itself. He reached the edge of town where buildings thinned and fences began. Beyond the last row of houses, the land opened into scrub and snow, broken by a few outbuildings half buried by drifts, a sagging shed, an old stack of timber, a collapsed lean-to. The wind was louder out here. In town it had obstacles. Here it had room to gather its strength. Caleb kept his eyes forward. He had learned that the easiest way to avoid choices was not to see what created them. His breath came out in controlled clouds. Frost collected in his beard and along his eyelashes. He was almost past the last fence line when a sound cut through the wind, thin, strained, unmistakably human. "Sir, please." Caleb stopped. For half a second his mind tried to dismiss it as weather, wind through boards, a loose hinge, the imagination of a tired man. Then the voice came again, closer and more urgent. "Please, sir, don't go." He turned toward the sound. 2 boys stood near the lumber pile, bundled in coats too, large, sleeves swallowing their hands. The taller one was 9 or so, though hunger had sharpened him into looking older. He had a narrow face, chapped cheeks, and eyes that tried hard to look fearless. His hair was brown and cut unevenly, like someone had trimmed it with kitchen shears. He stood slightly in front, angled protectively, his stance rehearsed. Behind him, half hidden at his side, was a smaller boy, 6 perhaps, with a cap pulled low and dark eyes that watched without blinking. The younger boy's expression wasn't panicked so much as intent, as if he were paying attention to something the storm couldn't touch. The older boy took one step forward. His boots sank in the drift, and he steadied himself with stubbornness more than balance. His voice shook, but he forced it to hold. "Mister," he said, "can you be our dad today?" The words landed with a weight that didn't match the child's size. Caleb felt his body tighten, the old instinct to refuse rising fast and automatic. He had no right to be anyone's father. He didn't even trust himself to be a good stranger. He opened his mouth to say no. Then the younger boy lifted his face fully into view. The wind tugged at his scarf, and for a moment his features were clear, pale skin raw from cold, a small mouth pressed into a line, eyes too steady for 6 years old. He didn't speak. He simply looked at Caleb as if Caleb had been expected to arrive, as if the storm had not brought an accident but delivered an answer. Caleb stood there, the cold pressing against him, the town behind him silent, the boys in front of him trembling and refusing to step back. His hands tightened in his pockets until his knuckles ached. He told himself it was not his problem. He told himself to keep moving. Instead, he took a slow step toward them. And in that single step, the simple plan he'd lived by for 4 years began to break. Caleb Rowan did not answer the boy right away. Silence had always been his first defense, a way to buy time while deciding whether a moment was dangerous or merely inconvenient. The wind pushed snow against his boots and rattled loose boards in the lumber pile beside them. The taller boy stood his ground, shoulders tight, jaw clenched hard enough to show the effort. The smaller one watched Caleb without blinking, his breath puffing out in thin, uneven clouds. They were both cold, past the point where shivering was dramatic. This was the quieter stage, where the body saved its energy. "My name's Ethan," the older boy said after a moment, as if he understood silence well enough to fill it when needed. His voice cracked on the first syllable but steadied by the end. "This is my brother, Noah." Noah gave a small nod, his chin barely lifting. He was slighter than Ethan, narrow through the shoulders, wrapped in a coat that had once belonged to someone much larger. The sleeves were rolled twice and still swallowed his hands. His dark hair curled at the edges of his cap, damp with melted snow. There was dirt ground into the knees of his trousers, the kind that came from kneeling on cold floors or frozen ground, not from play. His eyes were dark brown, almost black, and far too observant. They followed Caleb's face carefully, not with hope exactly, but with a quiet assessment, like a child who had learned to read weather before stepping outside. Caleb exhaled slowly. "Where's your father?" he asked. He kept his tone neutral, not gentle enough to promise anything, not harsh enough to scare them. Ethan swallowed. "He's dead," he said. He didn't lower his eyes. He'd already done the work of saying it enough times that the words came out clean. "Been dead almost a year." "And your mother?" Caleb asked. "She's sick," Ethan answered. "Real sick." Noah shifted closer to his brother, the side of his coat brushing Ethan's arm. He spoke then, his voice soft but certain. "She told us to wait." Caleb felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the warning ache that came when a story was heading somewhere he didn't want to follow. "Wait where?" "Here," Ethan said. "By the edge of town. She said not to go begging and not to go inside anywhere without asking. She said if someone kind came, we'd know." Caleb glanced back toward Silver Pine. Smoke still clung low over the rooftops. Somewhere a door slammed. The storm showed no sign of letting up. He looked down at the boys again. Their cheeks were raw and shining, lips pale, eyelashes clotted with frost. They had been standing there too long. "How long have you been out here?" he asked. Ethan hesitated, then held up his hands. He folded down 2 fingers. "Since morning." Caleb closed his eyes briefly. The day had barely begun, but it already felt heavy. Thanksgiving posters and church signs flickered through his mind. The talk of gratitude sitting uneasily beside 2 children freezing at the edge of town. He opened his eyes again and made a decision that felt less like a choice and more like a concession to gravity. "All right," he said. "Just for today." Ethan's breath left him in a rush, the sound halfway between a laugh and a sob. He nodded too fast, like he was afraid the answer might be taken back if he didn't secure it properly. Noah didn't react at first. He only watched Caleb with that same intent expression, as if measuring the weight of the promise. Then, slowly, he reached out and took a step closer, close enough that Caleb could see the fine cracks in his chapped skin. Caleb turned toward the path that led away from the lumber pile. "You walk ahead," he said. "Show me." They led him along a narrow track pressed into the snow, past the last fence and into a stand of young pines that offered some shelter from the wind. The boys walked carefully, conserving their energy, boots crunching in rhythm. Caleb shortened his stride to match theirs. He noticed things as they moved, the way Ethan checked behind him every few steps, counting, the way Noah kept one hand tucked into his sleeve and the other brushing the bark of trees as they passed, grounding himself. These were not children used to being looked after. These were children used to managing risk. Their house sat at the edge of the trees, a small, square structure of weathered timber with a pitched roof burdened by snow. Smoke rose thinly from the chimney, uneven but present. A shed leaned nearby, its door hanging crooked, and a stack of split firewood sat under a tarp weighed down with stones. The place was modest but well built. Caleb recognized the lines of careful craftsmanship immediately, the way the corners met cleanly, the roof angled just enough to shed snow. Someone had known what they were doing. "My dad built it," Ethan said, following Caleb's gaze. There was pride there, and grief braided tightly together. "Every part." Caleb nodded once, looked solid. Inside, the house was warmer than he expected. Not comfortable, but alive. A fire burned low in the hearth, banked carefully. The air smelled of pine smoke and something medicinal, sharp and bitter. A woman lay on a narrow bed near the stove, blankets pulled up to her chest. She turned her head at the sound of the door opening, and her eyes sharpened immediately. Eleanor Pike was younger than Caleb had expected, early 30s maybe, but illness had stripped years from her face. Her hair was dark blonde, pulled back in a loose braid that had begun to fray, strands escaping around her temples. Her skin was pale and drawn tight across her cheekbones, but there was strength in her gaze, a clear, assessing intelligence that hadn't been dulled by fever. She pushed herself up on one elbow, breath hitching, and fixed her eyes on Caleb. "Who are you?" she asked. Her voice was hoarse but steady. "My name's Caleb Rowan," he said. He took off his hat without thinking, a reflex that surprised him. "Your boys asked me to walk them home." Eleanor's eyes flicked to Ethan and Noah, and something like anger flared beneath the fear. "I told you to wait," she said sharply. "We did," Ethan replied. "We waited, but it was getting real cold." Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, as if measuring how much energy she could afford to spend on this argument. When she looked back at Caleb, her expression hardened. "I don't know what story they told you," she said, "but we don't need charity." Caleb shifted his weight. "I'm not offering any," he said. "I was passing through." "That so?" Eleanor's gaze dropped briefly to his satchel, his boots, the way he stood. Passing through tends to linger. Before Caleb could respond, a dry cough tore through Eleanor's chest, deep and rattling. She turned her face away, pressing a cloth to her mouth. When she lowered it, there was a faint rust-colored stain on the fabric. Noah noticed immediately. He moved to her side without a word, tucking the blanket more securely around her shoulders. Caleb felt the warning ache again, sharper now. He took a step back. "I won't stay if you don't want me to," he said, "but it's not safe for your boys to be outside like that." Eleanor studied him for a long moment. She was used to judging people quickly. Motherhood under pressure taught you that. Finally, she nodded once. "You can sit," she said. "Until the storm eases." Caleb sat on a wooden chair near the door. It creaked under his weight. He kept his hands visible, resting on his knees. Ethan hovered nearby, clearly unsure whether to relax or stay alert. Noah sat cross-legged by the fire, watching the flames with an intensity that suggested he was listening for something beyond sound. "Thanksgiving's coming," Eleanor said after a while. The words seemed to surprise her, as if they'd slipped out uninvited. "Henry always made a point of it, said it was important to remember what you still had." Caleb looked at the hearth, at the careful way the fire had been arranged. "Henry was your husband?" "Yes." Her mouth tightened around the name. He worked for the Black Hollow mine, carpenter, best one they had until he wasn't useful anymore. Caleb did not ask what she meant. He had learned that people offered the truth when they were ready. Silence gave it room. Ethan broke it instead. "Mom says Thanksgiving is about not being alone," he said. He looked at Caleb with a mixture of hope and challenge. "That's why we asked." Caleb swallowed. He thought of Sarah's table, of Thomas counting blessings with grave seriousness. He thought of how he had spent the last 4 Thanksgivings walking until his legs gave out, sleeping in barns or under bridges, convincing himself that solitude was a choice rather than a sentence. Noah looked up from the fire. "You stayed," he said quietly, as if stating a fact rather than expressing gratitude. "For today," Caleb replied. Noah nodded, satisfied. "That's enough." Outside, the wind pressed harder against the walls, testing them. Inside, the fire crackled, stubborn and small. Caleb sat in a stranger's house with 2 boys who had decided he mattered, and a woman who was weighing whether that decision would cost her more than it gave. For the first time in years, he did not stand up to leave. The storm did not pass quickly, but it softened, as storms sometimes do when they realize they have already made their point. By late afternoon, the wind lost its edge, settling into a steady breath that moved the treetops without trying to tear them free. Inside the Pike house, the light shifted from gray to the dull amber of early evening. Caleb noticed these changes the way a man who had spent years outdoors always did, not consciously, but with the quiet awareness that came from relying on weather for survival. Eleanor slept in fits. The fever loosened its grip for minutes at a time, then returned with a dry insistence that left her skin hot and her breathing shallow. When she slept, her face relaxed enough to show what illness had been stealing from her. A woman with fine features, a straight nose, and a stubborn line to her mouth that suggested she had not been raised to ask for help. Her hands were calloused, palms rough from work she had taken on herself since her husband died. Every so often she stirred, murmuring Henry's name, then fell silent again. Ethan took it upon himself to be useful. He brought water from a metal bucket near the door, careful not to spill. He fed small pieces of firewood into the hearth, copying the way his father had done it, spacing the logs so the flame would last. He watched Caleb with cautious attention, ready to intervene if this stranger did anything that felt wrong. There was a tension in him that had nothing to do with the cold, a vigilance learned young and practiced daily. Noah stayed near the fire, his small body folded inward, eyes tracking shadows on the wall. He did not fidget. He did not ask questions. When he moved, it was deliberate, as if he were listening for instructions that hadn't yet been spoken. Caleb had known children like that before, children who had learned early that silence could be a kind of safety. Caleb remained where he was, near the door. He didn't make himself comfortable. Comfort had a way of inviting permanence, and permanence was dangerous. Still, he found his attention drifting to the details of the house, the smoothness of the doorframe where hands had worn it down over years, the careful joinery of the shelves, the table built solid enough to survive generations. Whoever Henry Pike had been, he had built with the expectation that his work would last. Caleb felt a dull ache at that thought. Men who built like that believed in a future. "Did you know my dad?" Ethan asked suddenly. Caleb looked up. "No." Ethan nodded, as if that confirmed something he already suspected. "He didn't talk much to strangers either," he said, "but he fixed things for them anyway." Caleb didn't answer. He wasn't sure whether Ethan was offering information or issuing a warning. As evening settled, the sound of hooves cut through the quiet. Caleb's head came up immediately. He rose without hurry and moved to the window, careful not to silhouette himself against the glass. Outside, a single rider approached along the tree line, a lantern swinging from the saddle horn. The horse was a compact bay, winter-coated and patient, steam lifting from its nostrils. The rider sat straight-backed despite the cold, reins held with an economy that suggested long familiarity. The knock came moments later, firm but not aggressive. Eleanor stirred at the sound, her eyes opened, sharp even through fever. "Who is it?" she asked. "I'll see," Caleb said. He waited a beat, then opened the door. The man on the porch was in his late 50s, lean and weathered, with a gray mustache trimmed close and eyes the pale blue of old ice. His coat was a lawman's coat, heavy and worn smooth at the cuffs. A star-shaped badge caught the lantern light at his chest. His hat brim was dusted with snow, and his face held the guarded patience of someone accustomed to being disliked. "Evening," the man said. "Name's Walter Kincaid, sheriff." Caleb inclined his head. "Evening." Kincaid's gaze flicked past him into the house, taking in Ethan, Noah, and the bed near the fire. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Heard there was a stranger in town," he said. "Figured I'd check." Eleanor pushed herself upright, ignoring the way her breath stuttered. "You always check this late?" she asked. Kincaid met her eyes. There was history there, shared disappointment, unspoken arguments. "Evenings when trouble usually settles in," he said. Caleb studied him. Kincaid was not a young man chasing authority. He looked like someone who had been worn down by it. There were lines around his eyes that came from squinting into distance, and his hands were scarred, knuckles thickened by old breaks. This was a man who had likely tried once to do his job properly and paid for it in ways that never made the papers. "I'm passing through," Caleb said. "So I hear," Kincaid replied. "Problem is, folks who pass through don't usually end up at the Pike place." He paused. "Black Hollow's been asking questions." Eleanor's fingers tightened in the blanket. "About what?" "About who's been coming and going," Kincaid said. "About whether Henry left anything behind." The room went very still. Ethan's shoulders stiffened. Noah lifted his head, eyes fixed on the sheriff with an intensity that bordered on accusation. "He didn't," Eleanor said. "Henry left us, that's all." Kincaid looked at her for a long moment, then sighed. "I won't keep you," he said finally, "but I'd advise caution." His eyes returned to Caleb. "This town's not kind to men who stir things up." Caleb nodded once. "I'm not here to stir anything." Kincaid didn't smile. "That's what most men say." He turned back toward his horse, lantern swinging gently. "Storm's easing. Roads will be passable by morning." "I know," Caleb said. The sheriff paused, glancing back. "For what?" "It's worth," he added quietly. "Henry Pike was a good man." Then he mounted and rode away, the lantern glow bobbing until the trees swallowed it. Inside, the fire popped sharply, breaking the tension. Eleanor exhaled slowly. "He's not wrong," she said. "This town doesn't forgive curiosity." Caleb returned to his chair. "Black Hollow," he said. "They run the mine." "They run most things," Eleanor replied. "Bank?" "Store credit, half the church repairs." She closed her eyes briefly. "Henry found something he shouldn't have. I don't know all of it. He didn't tell me. Just said if anything happened, I was to keep the boys quiet and keep the house." Ethan looked between them. "Dad said the house remembers," he said. "He said if you listen, it tells you where things are." Caleb's attention sharpened. "What things?" Ethan hesitated. Noah answered instead. "The floor," he said. "It's not the same everywhere." Caleb followed the boy's gaze to the hearth. The stones around it were darkened with age, fitted tightly. But just beyond them, one plank in the floor sat a fraction higher than the rest. It was the kind of thing a carpenter would notice immediately and hide deliberately. Eleanor's eyes widened. "Noah." "It's okay," Noah said calmly. "Dad said someday someone would need it." Caleb rose slowly and knelt by the hearth. He pressed on the plank. It shifted with a soft, telling sound. Beneath it was a shallow cavity lined with oiled cloth. Inside lay a leather-bound notebook and a bundle of folded papers tied with twine. Eleanor stared as if she were seeing a ghost. "Henry never—" "He didn't want you scared," Ethan said quietly. Caleb lifted the notebook carefully. The leather was worn smooth by handling, the edges darkened by sweat and time. Inside, the handwriting was neat and precise, the work of a man who respected order. Diagrams of beams and supports filled the margins, along with numbers and notes that spoke of measurements altered, materials swapped, corners cut. "This isn't just carpentry," Caleb said. "No," Eleanor whispered. "It's proof." They sat in silence as the fire burned low, the house holding its breath around them. Outside, the storm finally loosened its grip. Inside, something heavier settled in its place. The knowledge that staying, even for one day, had already changed the shape of things. Caleb closed the notebook and placed it back where it belonged. "We'll leave it hidden," he said. "For now." Eleanor nodded. "Thanksgiving," she said softly. "Henry always said truth should be shared at a table." Caleb thought of the church sign, the community meal, the chairs waiting to be filled. He looked at Ethan and Noah, their faces lit by firelight, and felt the quiet certainty settle in his chest. "For today," he said again. And for the first time, the words felt less like a limit and more like a beginning. Morning came to the Pike house slowly, as if the sun itself needed time to decide whether Silverpine was worth the effort. The storm had retreated during the night, leaving behind a brittle silence and snow packed so hard it rang faintly underfoot. Pale light filtered through the frost-rimmed windows, turning the room the color of old bone. Caleb woke before anyone else, a habit that had survived grief, distance, and too many nights spent sleeping half aware. For a few seconds, he didn't remember where he was. Then the low crackle of the fire, the smell of pine smoke, and the steady, uneven sound of Eleanor's breathing brought everything back. He sat up carefully, mindful of the chair beneath him, and stretched stiffness from his shoulders. Outside, a raven called once from the tree line, its voice sharp against the quiet. Caleb moved to the door and opened it just enough to step onto the porch. The cold struck clean and bright, no longer biting but firm, as if winter had decided to watch rather than attack. Snow lay smooth across the clearing, unbroken except for the tracks left by the sheriff's horse the night before and the smaller prints of the boys pacing back and forth. A horse stood tied to a post near the shed, head lowered, tail flicking lazily. Caleb had noticed it only in passing the evening before. In the clearer light he saw it properly now. A bay mare, compact and strong, perhaps 10 years old, winter coat thick and glossy. One ear was nicked, an old injury healed long ago, and her tack was worn but well cared for. She watched Caleb with calm interest, dark eyes steady, the look of an animal accustomed to hard weather and harder days. "That yours?" Caleb asked quietly. Ethan appeared beside him, rubbing sleep from his eyes with the heel of his hand. "Dad's," he said. "Her name's Bramble." Caleb nodded. "She's a good horse." "She is," Ethan replied, pride softening his guarded tone. "Dad said a good horse remembers when you're tired before you do." Caleb looked at the mare again and felt the truth of that settle somewhere familiar. He had once owned a horse like that before everything burned. He turned back toward the house. Inside, Eleanor was awake. She lay propped against folded blankets, color faintly returned to her cheeks but her eyes still too bright. Fever clung to her like a second skin. Noah sat beside her, carefully spooning water to her lips, his movements patient and precise. He did not look up when Caleb entered, but his shoulders eased slightly, as if reassured by the sound of another adult in the room. "You didn't leave," Eleanor said. Caleb shook his head. "Storm passed late. Didn't see a reason to rush." Eleanor studied him, her gaze steady despite exhaustion. "Most men would have." "I'm not most men," he replied, and meant it more simply than it sounded. Ethan moved to the table, setting out the last of the bread and a small jar of preserved apples. Breakfast was sparse but orderly. Eleanor watched her sons eat, relief and worry mingling on her face. When they were finished, she motioned Caleb closer. "The things Henry left," she said quietly. "I don't know what to do with them." Caleb sat across from her. "He left them for a reason." "Yes," she said. "But reasons don't keep boys fed or roofs standing." Her voice tightened. "Black Hollow already took most of what we had. If they find out I'm holding proof, they won't," Caleb said. He didn't say how he knew. Certainty was often enough. "Not yet." Outside, the sound of boots crunching over snow carried through the thin walls. Ethan stiffened. Noah's spoon paused midair. Caleb rose, moving toward the door without haste. He opened it to find a man standing just beyond the porch rail, stamping snow from his feet. The man was tall and narrow, with a stooped posture that came from years bent over ledgers rather than labor. He wore a wool coat buttoned tight and wire-rimmed spectacles that fogged slightly as he breathed. His beard was sparse and uneven, more neglected than grown, and his eyes darted constantly, as if he expected to be overheard even by trees. "Morning," the man said, voice thin but polite. I'm Amos Laird. Caleb waited. I work at the bank, Laird continued, glancing past Caleb toward the house. Bookkeeper. I was told Mrs. Pike was ill. She is, Caleb replied. Laird nodded, swallowing. Black Hollow sent me to check accounts, he said. Just routine. Caleb stepped fully onto the porch, closing the door behind him. This isn't the bank. Laird's gaze flicked toward the trees, then back. No, he agreed. But debt has a way of traveling. He hesitated. Mr. Hale doesn't like uncertainty. Caleb smiled faintly, without warmth. Then he's in the wrong line of work. Laird's shoulders sagged a fraction. I don't like this any more than you do, he said quietly. But there are papers coming, notices. If Mrs. Pike can't settle by Thanksgiving. She won't, Caleb said. Laird blinked. Won't? No. The bookkeeper looked at him for a long moment, as if trying to place a face he'd seen somewhere else. Then he sighed. I'll say I didn't find her, he said. For now. He adjusted his glasses. But this town has ears, be careful. With that, he turned and walked back the way he'd come, boots leaving a narrow line of prints that quickly softened under drifting snow. Caleb watched until the man disappeared. Inside, Eleanor had heard enough. They're closing in, she said. Yes, Caleb replied, and they'll keep doing it. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. Henry said Thanksgiving was a deadline, she murmured, that after that things would change one way or another. Caleb thought of the church sign, the community meal. The town gathered in one place, pretending at gratitude. Sometimes deadlines work both ways, he said. As the morning wore on, Caleb set about small repairs. He fixed the loose hinge on the shed door, reinforced a weak step on the porch, and showed Ethan how to reset the latch so it wouldn't stick. The work was practical, grounding. His hands remembered the language of tools easily. Noah followed him, silent but attentive, handing him nails when asked, watching the way Caleb's hands moved. By noon, the sun had climbed enough to soften the air. Eleanor slept again, more deeply this time. Ethan stood at the window, watching the road. You really staying? He asked. Caleb joined him. For today, he said. Ethan nodded, but his eyes stayed fixed on the distance. That's what people say when they're scared to promise. Caleb considered that. That might be true, he said. But staying today still counts. Noah looked up from the floor where he'd been sketching lines in the dust. Dad said the hardest part isn't leaving, he said. It's deciding not to. Caleb felt the weight of those words settle in him. Outside, Bramble lifted her head and snorted softly, as if in agreement. Somewhere beyond the trees, Silverpine waited, its church bells silent, its ledgers balancing fear against truth. Caleb Rowan stood in the Pike house, tools in his hands, children at his side, a sick woman sleeping nearby, and understood something he had avoided for 4 years. Staying was not passive. It was a choice that carried consequences, and those consequences were already beginning to knock. He set his tools down and looked at the boys. We'll need to be ready, he said. For what? Ethan asked. For Thanksgiving, Caleb replied. And this time, the word didn't feel like an escape. The day slipped toward evening with the quiet tension of a held breath. Clouds gathered again over the ridges, not with the violence of the previous storm, but with a slow, deliberate weight, the kind that promised snow by nightfall. Inside the Pike house, the fire burned steady and low. Caleb had learned long ago that flames, like people, did better when they weren't forced. Eleanor woke near mid-afternoon, the fever receding enough to leave her clear-eyed and exhausted rather than delirious. She insisted on sitting up, wrapped in a shawl Henry had made from an old army blanket, the stitching still visible where he had reinforced the seams. Her hands trembled when she lifted the cup Caleb offered her, but she drank without complaint. They won't wait until Thanksgiving, she said quietly, as if finishing a thought she'd been carrying all day. Black Hollow never does. Caleb leaned against the table, arms folded. No, he agreed. They test first. Ethan sat on the floor near the hearth, sharpening a pencil with a small knife. The blade was dull, and the work required patience more than force. Noah knelt beside him, watching the curl of wood fall away. Both boys listened without appearing to. They had learned that adult conversations often decided things long before anyone asked their opinion. A sound drifted in from outside, Hooves again, but more than one set this time. Caleb straightened, his attention narrowing. He moved to the window and parted the curtain just enough to see. Two riders approached along the tree line, their horses picking careful paths through the packed snow. They rode close together, not talking. Men who traveled that way were not out for company. "Inside," Caleb said softly. "Both of you." Ethan hesitated. No, it didn't. He rose immediately and moved to Eleanor's side, placing himself between her and the door. Ethan followed, jaw tight but obedient. The knock came moments later, louder than the sheriff's had been, less polite. Caleb opened the door. The man closest to him was tall and broad, shoulders hunched slightly as if braced for resistance. His beard was thick and dark, untrimmed, with snow clinging to it in uneven patches. A scar pulled one side of his mouth downward, giving his expression a permanent sneer. His eyes were small and sharp, the eyes of someone who enjoyed leverage. The second man stood half a step behind him, younger, narrower, with a blonde mustache just beginning to fill in. He kept his hands visible, resting on his belt, but his gaze flicked constantly, assessing angles and exits. "Afternoon?" the larger man said. His voice was rough, worn by shouting over machinery. "Name's Cole Barrett." Caleb waited. "I work security for Black Hollow," Barrett continued. "This here's Will Dawson." He jerked his head back toward the younger man, who nodded once, unsmiling. "We're here on business." Caleb met Barrett's gaze evenly. "You won't find him Tennessee. It here." Barrett's grin widened, showing uneven teeth. "Find what? Whatever you think you're looking for." Barrett laughed, a short bark of sound that held no humor. "That's not how this goes," he said. "We ask questions, you answer them. Mrs. Pike signs what she's supposed to sign, and everyone eats Thanksgiving dinner without trouble." Behind Caleb, Eleanor shifted. "I'm not signing anything," she called out. Barrett leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You should talk sense into her," he said to Caleb. "Men who involve themselves tend to regret it." Caleb's expression didn't change. "You're done here." For a moment it looked like Barrett might enjoy pushing further. His jaw worked, eyes narrowing as he weighed options. Then his gaze slid past Caleb, catching sight of Ethan and Noah standing rigid near the hearth. Something flickered. Calculation, perhaps annoyance. "Kids," Barrett said lightly. "Cold out there. You boys ought to be inside." "They are," Caleb said. Barrett straightened. "We'll be back," he said. "Before supper next time." He turned away, signaling Dawson with a tilt of his head. As they walked back toward their horses, Barrett added over his shoulder, "Town doesn't like surprises." Caleb watched until the riders disappeared into the trees. Only then did he close the door. Eleanor exhaled shakily. "That was Cole Barrett," she said. "Henry warned me about him. He used to work the lower shafts, got injured when a support failed, lost 2 fingers. After that, he started doing Hale's dirty work." Caleb nodded. Men like Barrett always had a story like that, an injury that turned disappointment into loyalty for the wrong reasons. Ethan spoke before Caleb could respond. "They're going to come back," he said. "Yes," Caleb replied. "They are." Noah looked up at him. "Tonight?" Caleb considered the weight of the question. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe tomorrow." Outside, the light faded. Snow began again, fine and persistent. The Pike house stood quiet against it, smoke lifting straight from the chimney now that the wind had calmed. Caleb moved deliberately, checking the latch, testing the windows. He found an old rifle mounted above the hearth, the wood worn smooth by use. He took it down carefully. "Dad's," Ethan said. "He taught me how." Caleb handed it back. "Then you remember the rules." Ethan nodded, solemn. "Only if there's no other choice." "That's right." As dusk settled fully, another presence made itself known. A low whine sounded from near the shed, followed by a tentative scratch at the door. Noah moved first this time, opening it just enough to let a dog slip inside. The animal was a mutt, medium-sized, with a thick, shaggy coat mottled brown and white. One ear flopped permanently, the other standing half upright as if undecided. His muzzle was gray with age, and his tail wagged in cautious arcs. He limped slightly on his back leg, an old injury poorly healed. "That's Buck," Ethan said. "He belonged to Dad, too. He doesn't like strangers." Buck sniffed the air, then approached Caleb, nose low. He circled once, twice, then sat heavily on the floor and leaned against Caleb's leg with a quiet huff, as if satisfied. Caleb rested a hand on the dog's head. Buck's fur was coarse but warm. "Smart dog," he murmured. Night settled in fully. Eleanor slept again, deeper now, exhaustion overtaking fear. Ethan and Noah sat together near the fire, Buck stretched between them. Caleb took the chair by the door, rifle resting across his knees, eyes on the shadows beyond the window. He didn't sleep. Outside, somewhere in the trees, a branch cracked under weight that did not belong to wind or snow. Buck's head lifted, ears pricking. Caleb tightened his grip slightly, heart steady, mind clear. Thanksgiving was 3 days away, and the town was already knocking. The night did not bring the violence Caleb expected. Instead, it brought something worse. Waiting. Snow continued to fall in a thin, steady veil, softening sound and distance alike. The world beyond the Pike house shrank to what could be seen through frost-laced glass and the pale circle of firelight inside. Caleb remained awake, his back straight against the chair, rifle balanced easily across his knees. Buck lay at his feet, eyes half closed but ears alert, tail twitching when the wind shifted or the house settled. Caleb had learned long ago that men rarely attacked when anger burned hottest. They waited until patience ran thin, until fear did its quiet work. Black Hollow understood that. They were not finished for the day. They were measuring. Sometime after midnight, the snow eased. The silence that followed felt deliberate, as if the land itself were holding still. Buck lifted his head and let out a low growl, not loud enough to wake the house, but clear in its intent. Caleb rose slowly and crossed to the window. Nothing moved. The tree line stood dark and unmoving, the shapes of pines stacked against the sky like black teeth. Eleanor stirred. "Caleb?" Her voice was weak but steady. "I'm here," he said. She pushed herself upright with effort, her shawl slipping from one shoulder. Even in the low light, he could see the toll the fever had taken. Her hair, once a deep chestnut, had dulled with sweat and neglect, pulled back loosely at the nape of her neck. Her face was still strong, angular in a way that suggested resolve more than softness, but the hollows beneath her cheekbones had deepened. She had the look of a woman who had been holding things together for too long without rest. "They're not coming tonight," she said. It wasn't a question. "No," Caleb agreed. "Not yet." Eleanor nodded. Henry used to say the worst moments were always quiet first. She glanced toward her sons, sleeping side by side on a pallet near the hearth. Buck stretched protectively between them. He hated waiting. Caleb's gaze followed hers. Ethan slept with his fists clenched, brow furrowed even in rest. Noah lay still, breath slow and even, one hand resting unconsciously against Buck's flank. Children who slept like that had learned early that peace was temporary. "They'll try another way," Eleanor continued. "Legal papers, deputies, men who smile and pretend they're helping." "Yes," Caleb said. "They'll want witnesses." Eleanor's mouth tightened. "This town won't give us any." Caleb did not answer immediately. His thoughts had already begun to move ahead, tracing lines through Silverpine's routines and loyalties. Towns like this one had predictable rhythms: church bells on Thanksgiving morning, a shared meal by noon, men lingering afterward with full stomachs and loose tongues. Black Hollow's reach was wide, but it depended on silence more than force. At dawn, Caleb saddled Bramble, the mare, stamped impatiently, breath puffing white as he tightened the cinch. Buck followed him out, limping slightly but determined, nose low to the ground as if reading the snow. Ethan watched from the porch, arms crossed tightly against his chest. "You're going into town," he said. "Yes." "Are you coming back?" Caleb met the boy's eyes. "Yes." Ethan studied his face, searching for the kind of certainty children learned not to trust easily. Finally, he nodded. "Then tell Mrs. Hale we don't need her pies." Caleb almost smiled. Silverpine at dawn was subdued, the town half buried in fresh snow. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin columns, and the street lay quiet except for the crunch of hooves. Caleb rode Bramble slowly, Buck trotting alongside, drawing looks from behind curtained windows. He felt them measuring him, weighing rumor against reality. The general store stood at the center of town, its front window filled with jars of preserves and bolts of cloth. Inside, the warmth was heavy with the smell of coffee and cured meat. A woman stood behind the counter, arranging tins with brisk efficiency. She was in her early 40s, sturdy rather than tall, with iron-gray streaks threading through dark hair pulled into a tight bun. Her face held the kind of calm that came from managing both inventory and people. "Mornin'," she said without looking up. "We're low on sugar." "I won't take much," Caleb replied. She glanced up then, eyes sharp and assessing. "You're the man staying out at Pike's." Caleb nodded. "I'm Margaret Hale," she said. "Victor's wife." She waited, perhaps expecting discomfort. Caleb gave none. "Pleasure." Margaret's gaze lingered on him. There was something calculating there, but also something tired. "People are talking," she said. "They always do when they're afraid." "And you?" Caleb asked. She set a tin down carefully. "I mind my business." Caleb believed her. Women like Margaret survived by understanding exactly where their power lay. "I came for coffee and nails," he said. "You'll get them," she replied, "on credit." "I'll pay." Margaret smiled thinly. "So you will." She leaned in slightly. "Thanksgiving service is at 10, meal right after, town'll be full." "I know." As Caleb turned to leave, Margaret added, almost as an afterthought, "My husband doesn't like uncertainty either." Caleb paused. "Neither do I." Outside, Buck shook snow from his coat and resumed his place at Bramble's side. Caleb did not linger. He rode past the bank, past the sheriff's office, noting which windows were lit, which doors opened early. He saw Sheriff Kincaid standing across the street, speaking quietly with a farmer whose shoulders sagged beneath an invisible burden. Kincaid glanced up and met Caleb's eyes, his expression unreadable. Back at the Pike house, Eleanor was awake again. She listened as Caleb described the town, Margaret Hale, the unspoken warning beneath courtesy. "She knows," Eleanor said. "She's always known." "Knowing and acting aren't the same," Caleb replied. By late afternoon, the air grew colder again. Snow clouds gathered low and heavy. Ethan helped Caleb stack firewood near the back wall, their movements efficient, almost companionable now. Noah sat at the table with Henry's notebook open, tracing diagrams with his finger. "He drew everything twice," Noah said, "so he wouldn't forget." Caleb looked over his shoulder. "Or so someone else wouldn't." Noah nodded solemnly. "Dad said if people see the truth, they can't unsee it." That night, a lantern appeared at the edge of the clearing. Not two, just one. Caleb stepped onto the porch, rifle ready but lowered. The figure approached slowly, boots sinking into the snow with deliberate care. Sheriff Kincaid stopped a few feet from the steps. He removed his hat, holding it against his chest. In the lantern light, his face looked older, lines deeper, eyes rimmed with red. "I shouldn't be here," he said. "No," Caleb agreed. "But I am." Kincaid exhaled. "Barrett's been bragging. Says Thanksgiving will be settled one way or another." Eleanor came to the door, leaning heavily on the frame. "You going to stop it?" Kincaid closed his eyes briefly. "I can't," he said. "Not openly." He met Caleb's gaze. "But I can look the other way, and I can make sure the right people are present when things come out." Caleb studied him. "Why?" Kincaid's jaw tightened. "Because Henry Pike deserved better, and because I'm tired of telling myself I couldn't do anything." He replaced his hat. "I'll see you at church." He turned and walked back into the snow. Inside, the house felt smaller, warmer, heavier with consequence. Eleanor sank into a chair, exhausted. "That makes 3 days," she said softly. 3 days until Thanksgiving." Caleb nodded. "And until everyone's in one place." Outside, the wind rose again, carrying the promise of more snow. Buck settled near the door, head resting on his paws, eyes open. Bramble shifted in the shed, hooves thudding softly against wood. The night carried many things toward the Pike house: fear, resolve, truth waiting its turn. Caleb sat with all of it, understanding at last that staying meant standing still long enough for the storm to come to him. Thanksgiving. Eve arrived without ceremony, the way difficult days often do. Silverpine woke under a low ceiling of cloud that pressed the town inward, muting sound and color alike. Snow had fallen again during the night, not enough to trap anyone indoors, but enough to remind them that winter would not negotiate. From the Pike House, the road to town cut a pale line through the trees, already marked by wagon ruts and boot prints from men with errands they pretended were ordinary. Caleb rose early. He moved quietly, checking the fire, tightening his coat, settling the rifle in its place above the hearth where it could be reached without alarm. Buck followed him from room to room, nails clicking softly on the floor, tail low but steady. The dog's limp was more pronounced in the cold. Age and injury made themselves known when the weather turned. Bramble shifted in the shed as Caleb stepped outside, ears flicking toward him. He fed her grain and ran a hand along her neck, feeling the warmth beneath her winter coat, the calm strength of an animal that did not panic at approaching storms. Inside, Eleanor sat wrapped in her shawl, awake and alert. The fever had retreated further overnight, leaving behind weakness and a brittle clarity. Her hair was braided loosely over one shoulder now, the chestnut color dulled but still rich in the firelight. She watched Caleb with an expression that mixed gratitude and worry. "You don't have to go," she said. "I do," he replied. "Today matters." Ethan and Noah ate quietly. Ethan's jaw worked as he chewed, his gaze fixed on nothing in particular. Noah finished first and stood, slipping on his coat without being told. "I'll stay," Ethan said quickly. "With Mom." Noah shook his head. "Dad said witnesses need to see things," he said, "not just hear about them." Caleb looked between the boys, then nodded. "You come with me," he said to Noah. "You listen. You don't speak unless I ask." Noah's mouth pressed into a serious line. "I can do that." The church sat on a small rise at the edge of town, its white clapboard walls stark against the gray sky. Henry Pike had built its frame. Caleb could see the hand of a careful craftsman in the way the beams aligned, even through paint and years. The bell did not ring yet. People gathered in clusters outside, boots crunching, voices low. Thanksgiving Eve always brought a meeting. Last-minute arrangements for the meal, prayers for the miners still underground, reminders about gratitude spoken with an urgency that bordered on demand. Reverend Thomas Bell stood near the door, greeting parishioners with measured warmth. He was a tall man in his early 40s, narrow-shouldered, hair thinning at the crown, his beard trimmed close and neat. There was a softness to his eyes that suggested compassion, but also a carefulness that came from learning when to speak and when to wait. His wife, Anna, stood beside him, small and pale, hands folded, offering smiles that did not quite reach her eyes. Caleb felt the looks turn toward him as he approached with Noah at his side and Buck limping faithfully behind. Murmurs followed, recognition, rumor knitting itself into certainty. Reverend Bell hesitated, then stepped forward. "Mr. Rowan," he said. "You're welcome." Caleb inclined his head. "Reverend." Bell's gaze dropped to Noah. "And this must be one of Henry's boys." "Yes," Caleb said. "Noah." Bell nodded, something tightening in his expression. "Henry was a good man," he said. "We miss him." Noah looked up at the church door, then back at Bell. "Dad said buildings tell the truth," he said quietly. "If you know how to look." Bell's mouth opened slightly, then closed. "They do," he agreed after a moment. Inside, the church smelled of cold wood and old hymnals. Long tables had been set along the side walls, covered with cloths awaiting food that would arrive tomorrow. Candles flickered along the aisle. People took their seats, coats folded over laps, faces expectant and wary. Caleb chose a place near the aisle, close enough to stand without spectacle. Noah sat beside him, hands folded, eyes forward. Buck lay at their feet, chin resting on his paws. The meeting began with prayer, voices rising together, then falling. Announcements followed. Who would bring bread? Who would bring pies? Who would say grace? The rhythm was familiar, comforting in its predictability. Then Reverend Bell cleared his throat. "There is another matter," he said, "before we adjourn." A ripple moved through the pews. Victor Hale stood near the back, his presence commanding attention without effort. He was a large man, broad in the chest, his beard meticulously groomed, dark hair combed back from a high forehead. His coat was of fine wool, his boots polished, He smiled easily, the practiced smile of a man accustomed to being thanked. Beside him stood Cole Barrett, arms crossed, scarred mouth set in a knowing line. "Some concerns have been raised," Hale said, stepping forward. His voice filled the space smoothly. "About rumors. About unrest. I want to assure everyone that Black Hollow remains committed to this town, to its safety, to its future." Caleb rose. The sound of movement cut through the room. Conversation stopped. Hale's smile tightened, but he did not step back. "This isn't the time," Hale said. "It is," Caleb replied. He did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Tomorrow is Thanksgiving. You said yourself that gratitude matters. So does truth." Hale's eyes flicked to Reverend Bell, then back. "You're stirring fear." "No," Caleb said. "I'm ending it." He reached into his coat and withdrew Henry Pike's notebook. He held it up, not high, just enough to be seen. A murmur swept the room. "That book belongs to a dead man," Hale said sharply. "It belongs to this town," Caleb replied. "Henry Pike built this church. He documented what was used to build it. He documented what was replaced with cheaper materials. He documented who signed off." Reverend Bell stepped forward, color draining from his face. "Is this true?" he asked, his voice barely steady. Caleb opened the notebook to a marked page and handed it to Bell. "Page 42, he said. "Beam thickness, mortar composition." Bell read. His hands trembled. He turned the page, then another. Silence spread, heavy and complete. Margaret Hale stood abruptly from her seat. She moved to her husband's side, eyes scanning the room, then the notebook. For a brief moment, something like fear crossed her face. "This is a lie," Hale said. "A forgery." A woman rose from the front pew. She was small, wrapped in a worn black coat, her hair pulled back severely. Her face was lined deeply, grief etched into every crease. "My husband died in shaft 3, she said. "Support failed. You said it was an accident." Another man stood. "My brother," he said. "Same shaft." Reverend Bell closed the notebook and looked at Hale. "If this is accurate," he said slowly, "this building is unsafe." Hale's composure cracked. "You don't understand." I understand enough," Bell interrupted, "and so will everyone else." Sheriff Kincaid appeared at the door, his presence steadying and unmistakable. He did not speak. He did not need to. Caleb looked around the room, meeting faces. Fearful, angry, relieved. "Tomorrow," he said, "we were meant to gather and say what we're thankful for. Before that, you deserve to know what you've been standing on." Noah stood beside him then, small but unyielding. "Dad said if people see the truth," he said clearly, "they can't unsee it." The room breathed as one. Outside, the clouds lowered further. Snow began again, soft and relentless. Inside the church, the truth had found its place, and nothing, not even Thanksgiving, would move it again. Thanksgiving morning came clear and cold, the kind of Montana morning that felt scrubbed clean by night snow and silence. Silverpine woke cautiously, as if unsure whether the truth revealed the evening before would still be there when daylight arrived. It was. Smoke rose from chimneys in steadier columns now. Doors opened. People stepped outside and looked at one another longer than usual, measuring not fear this time, but resolve. At the Pike house, the day began with work. Caleb split wood while Buck watched from a sunny patch near the door, tail thumping softly whenever chips flew too close. The dog looked older in daylight, his muzzle more gray than brown, his limp more pronounced. But there was a steadiness to him, a settled acceptance that came from having chosen his people and deciding that was enough. Bramble stamped in the shed, eager for grain, her breath fogging the air as Caleb brushed frost from her mane. The mare leaned into the touch, solid and unbothered, as if she understood that storms passed, but hands that stayed mattered. Inside, Eleanor stood at the table for the first time in days. She moved slowly, carefully, but she was on her feet. Her face still bore the pallor of illness, but her eyes were clear. She wore a simple dress and Henry's old sweater over it, sleeves pushed back to reveal hands still unsteady but determined. Ethan hovered close, ready to catch her if she swayed. Noah set plates with deliberate precision, counting silently, lips moving as he worked. "We'll walk," Eleanor said when Caleb suggested the wagon. "I want to feel the ground." The church bell rang at 10, not with its usual confident swing, but with a measured, deliberate cadence. People gathered in the open space beside the church instead of inside it. Tables had been moved outdoors, closer to the light, away from beams now suspected and doubted. Food arrived in baskets and tins: roasted turkey, potatoes, bread still warm from ovens, pies wrapped in cloth. There was less abundance than in years past, but more hands helping to arrange it. Reverend Bell stood at the edge of the gathering, his posture straighter than it had been the night before. The carefulness was still there, but it had shifted. He looked like a man who had decided that caution no longer served its purpose. Annabelle stood beside him, one hand resting lightly at his back, offering quiet strength. Sheriff Kincaid arrived alone, his badge catching the sunlight. He spoke briefly with several townsmen, farmers, a mill worker, the widow in black from the front pew. No one raised their voice. Decisions seemed to be making themselves. Victor Hale didn't come. Margaret Hale did. She stood apart at first, her coat buttoned tightly, her face pale and composed. When she saw Eleanor approach with the boys, she stepped forward. "Mrs. Pike," she said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes flicked to the ground briefly before lifting again. "I wanted to say, I didn't know. Not all of it." Eleanor studied her, then nodded once. "Knowing comes when it comes," she replied. "What matters is what you do after." Margaret inhaled slowly. "I brought bread," she said, "and I've closed the store today. People can wait." Eleanor accepted the basket. "Thank you." The meal began without ceremony. People served one another, passed plates, asked after children and crops and weather. Conversations overlapped, tentative at first, then easier. Laughter surfaced, surprising and brief, like birdsong after a storm. Caleb stood near the edge, content to watch. He had learned that some moments were best witnessed rather than claimed. Noah joined him, slipping his small hand into Caleb's coat pocket without looking up. Buck lay nearby, head on his paws, eyes half closed in the sun. Reverend Bell cleared his throat. "Before we eat further," he said, "I ask that we pause." The gathering quieted. "Thanksgiving is about gratitude," he continued. "But gratitude without honesty is just habit. Yesterday this town chose honesty. Today we choose what comes next." He gestured to Sheriff Kincaid, who stepped forward. "There will be an investigation," Kincaid said. "Independent. Until then, Black Hollow's operations are suspended." A murmur ran through the crowd. Relief, disbelief, something like hope. Caleb felt Noah's grip tighten. He looked down. "Is it over?" Noah asked quietly. "Not all of it," Caleb replied. "But this part matters." Ethan approached, carrying 2 plates piled higher than sense. "You're eating," he said, handing one to Caleb with an expression that dared him to refuse. Caleb accepted it. "Yes, sir." They sat together on a low bench. Eleanor joined them, exhaustion and satisfaction etched equally across her face. For a moment, none of them spoke. They ate. The simple act felt ceremonial. After the meal, as people lingered, Sheriff Kincaid approached Caleb. He removed his hat, holding it awkwardly. "Federal men will arrive in a few days," he said. "Until then, things may be unsettled." Caleb nodded. "We'll manage." Kincaid hesitated. "Henry Pike's name will be cleared," he added. "I'll see to it." Eleanor looked up at that. Her eyes filled, but she did not let the tears fall. "Thank you," she said. As afternoon stretched, the crowd thinned. Children ran through the snow, cheeks flushed. Pies were divided and wrapped. Promises were made and not immediately doubted. When the Pike family began the walk home, Caleb fell into step beside Eleanor. The road felt different underfoot, no less cold but less heavy. "You could still leave," Eleanor said, not looking at him. "No one would think less of you." Caleb considered the familiar instinct to keep moving, to stay unclaimed. He looked at Ethan, who was explaining something animatedly to Buck, and at Noah, who walked close, shoulders relaxed for once. "I'm not staying forever," Caleb said carefully. "But I'm staying long enough," Eleanor smiled faintly. "That's how it starts." At the house, the fire was lit again. The light slanted through the windows, catching dust motes and turning them gold. Caleb repaired a loose chair leg while the boys argued over whose turn it was to feed Bramble. Buck settled near the hearth with a satisfied grunt. As evening came on, Eleanor sat at the table and took Henry's notebook from the shelf. She opened it, then closed it gently. "We'll keep it," she said, "but we won't hide it anymore." Caleb nodded. Good. When the sun dipped behind the trees, Noah spoke. We didn't say what we're thankful for. Ethan groaned. That's for church. Noah shook his head. Dad said you should say it where you live. They sat together, the house quiet around them. Buck lifted his head. Bramble snorted softly outside. Ethan went first. I'm thankful Mom's still here, he said quickly, and that the house didn't fall down. Noah thought longer. I'm thankful people listened, he said, and that we're not quiet anymore. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. I'm thankful, she said, that my boys don't have to grow up thinking fear is normal. They looked at Caleb. He hesitated, then spoke. I'm thankful I stayed. No one laughed, no one argued. Outside, night settled in gently. The Pike house stood firm against it, warmed by fire and something steadier than heat. Caleb sat back in his chair, Buck's head heavy against his boot, and felt the quiet settle, not the waiting kind, but the earned kind. Thanksgiving had passed. What remained was work and truth, and the simple, stubborn act of being there when it mattered. And for now, that was enough. Sometimes the miracle doesn't arrive with thunder or fire from the sky. Sometimes it comes quietly, in the form of a man who chooses to stay, in the courage of a mother who refuses to be silent, in the faith of children who believe help will come, even when the world has given them every reason to stop believing. The Bible tells us that God often works through ordinary people, in ordinary moments, doing extraordinary good. Not everyone who answers a prayer knows they were sent. Not every miracle looks like one. In our daily lives, we may not face storms like Silverpine, but we all know what it feels like to be afraid, to feel forgotten, to wonder if anyone sees our struggle. And maybe, just maybe, God is calling us to be someone else's quiet miracle, to show up, to listen, to stay. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from, your city, your country, your corner of the world. And if you believe no child, no soul, no living being should ever face fear alone, please subscribe to the channel and walk with us on this journey. May God bless you and your family. May He watch over you, give you strength in hard seasons, and remind you, you are never truly alone. Thank you for being here.